Hi everybody, welcome to session 1.6. This is the last of the sessions for Unit 1, where we're talking about nonprofit legal structures. And we're going to talk in this session about employees and volunteers and the legal roles that they play within a nonprofit organization. The goals are to understand and describe something called the principal-agent relationship. This is a legal relationship that affects the legal liability of nonprofit corporations. We're going to talk about, or I want you to be able to demonstrate familiarity with the current demographics of nonprofit employees, and then to explain the keys to leading volunteers, as well as the legal relationship between volunteers and nonprofits. Where we'll spend most of our time in this topic is on this idea of principal-agent relationships. And let me describe how this works. I'm going to use a metaphor or a story, which is not just metaphorical. This is a story with legally true consequences. I want you to imagine that you are gathered with your study group preparing for this exam. So you've pulled together a couple classmates and you're studying for this test that's coming up. Well, each of you in this situation are going to start off as what we call the principal. And what we mean by this is you, as an individual, have the legal authority to decide what happens with yourself and your stuff. It's not a legal authority that somebody else has, it's something that you have. And if you're a study group here, you can collectively be the principal, meaning like you as the study group decide the fate. And this would be like a nonprofit board of directors deciding the fate of the nonprofit. In this case, you're a study group that gets to decide the collective fate of the study group. Well, pretend that you're studying into dinner time and you want to get some pizza to help you keep studying. And so what you do is you turn to one of your study group members and you say, hey, Stanley, I don't think anybody in the class is named Stanley, but hey, Stanley, we're going to give you the authority to be our agent. And what we're going to do is we're going to give you the authority to order and purchase and deliver to us a couple pizzas so we can keep studying and eat while we do it. So you tell Stanley, okay, go get us some pizzas, and you all hand some money over to Stanley. And so you've now delegated to him authority to represent the study group individually and collectively. So you've all said, hey, we agree we're sending Stanley off to represent us in this purchase of pizza. So he's now your legally binding agent. And what he's going to do is if he does his job well, he's going to go pick a pizza restaurant that everybody's happy with, order the food that everybody's happy with. He'll pay the restaurant owner, he'll get the food, and he'll return safely to the study group with the pizza. And that all makes sense, right? But what if something goes awry? What if, for example, he gets into trouble on the way? And it can happen in a couple ways. And so to introduce what I mean, let's step back and ask the legal question. What can the agent do that is legally binding on the principal? So what could Stanley do in this situation that would cause legal problems for the study group? Well, there are two ways that the agent could get the study group into trouble. First is by entering into and then violating any contract. And secondly is committing any tort in the course of agency. Now, you remember from session 1.3, we talked about what a tort is. A tort is an injury to person or property, intentional or not, that creates liability. And so in this case, a tort might be, for example, that let's say Stanley, we're going to take the second point here first. Let's pretend that Stanley, while driving to the pizza restaurant to pick up the pizza, hits a college student who's riding a bicycle. So just wham, runs into this college kid. The kid is injured. He needs medical attention. He needs his bike fixed. His laptop got broken, all the sort of bad things that would happen in that situation. Because Stanley was on his way to getting the pizza, and this would be the same would be true if he was returning from the restaurant with the pizza, he was in the course of agency, which means Stanley was acting, he was traveling to carry out this purpose that was delegated to him by the study group. So he was in the course of his agency. And in the process, he committed this tort by hitting this kid on a bike. And that tort would then be legally binding, not just on Stanley, but also on the study group. The study group now has this legal liability because they had empowered Stanley to get them a pizza. And now Stanley went and hit some poor BYU student who's riding his bike innocently. This is the sort of thing that applies. This is, by the way, insurance is such an important part of any business venture or any kind of activity, because if you have people going out like driving trucks that your company owns, or even trucks that they own but that they're driving in the course of doing their job, that imposes liability on the business owner or the nonprofit. So that's an example of a tort in the course of agency. Now, you may have some questions like, what happens if Stanley swings by his house to pick up something before he comes back to the study group, and you didn't ask him to do that? If he hits the kid on the bike on the way to his house, is that in the course of agency? The answer is no in that instance, for example. But you might have other scenarios or instances that you want to discuss in class. So that second bullet point, that's how that works, and how the agent's behavior can be binding on the principal. But what about contracts? Let's pretend that Stanley orders a pizza and then goes to the restaurant, and the restaurant owner turns his back, and Stanley thinks, you know what, this is free pizza. So he takes the pizza, doesn't pay the owner, keeps the money for himself. And then the restaurant owner says, hey, Stanley, you owe me money for that pizza. And then he also decides to sue the study group for the value of the pizza. Because the contract was entered into on behalf of the principal in a way that was empowered, so that the agent did what the principal asked, which was enter into an agreement about this pizza, then the study group is on the hook for the cost of the pizza as well, not just Stanley. And so this is an example of where a contract can be binding, even though the agent did it just on behalf of the principal, even if the principal, didn't choose that specific contract. So this is how the principal-agent relationship works. And there are three, but I want to talk about agency in particular, because there are three different kinds of agency in the law that will be important to the way you think about this legal question. The first is express agency. And this is where the principal told the agent what to do. So you said, Stanley, go buy his pizza. That's express agency. You've given him the power to go get pizza. The second is implied agency, which is where you didn't tell them how to do it. You didn't tell them, a specific detail of what you're asking them to do, but it's just sort of an implied part of their agency that they're allowed to do that. So you didn't tell Stanley, for example, to drive his car to get the pizza, but it's implied that he would go drive his car. And so that's an example of implied agency that still is binding on the principal, even though you didn't tell Stanley how to get the pizza, because you didn't tell him how. It's implied that he could use reasonable means to do it, like driving to the restaurant. And then finally, the last kind of agency is apparent agency. And this is where there's a third party who has a reasonable belief that the agent represents the principal. Now, it is harder to apply to the pizza analogy, but let's pretend that you guys were studying and, on a weekly basis, and every week Stanley would go get the pizza and return back with it. And so this was like a weekly thing. And every week Stanley was saying, hey, my study group's going to pay for this online, trust us. And week after week, the study group pays for it online. Well, then let's pretend that there's a week that you guys are off and you're not studying that week. And Stanley goes to the pizza restaurant and says, hey, I'm going to get another pizza, and don't worry, the study group's going to pay for it. In that case, the restaurant owner would have a very reasonable belief that Stanley has been properly empowered, even though the study group didn't give him that power. And in that case, it's actually the study group's fault for not telling the restaurant owner, like, hey, this week Stanley is not buying pizza for us. Now, that's kind of a silly example, but you can see how this would apply to a nonprofit. Because let's say you had an employee who worked for your nonprofit, was regularly entering into contracts on behalf of the nonprofit. That person either left or you fired them, and then they keep on entering into contracts on your behalf. It's on the nonprofit what's happening here, because they didn't go actively tell these other parties like, hey, so-and-so doesn't work for us anymore. And maybe, like, for example, you didn't take away their business cards, or you didn't take away their uniform if you use uniforms. If you gave signs of agency and you failed to revoke signs of agency, then that creates apparent agency. And even if there's not actual agency there in the form of express or implied agency, you're still on the hook for it. Remember, this might seem unfair, but remember why agency law exists. It exists to protect the most innocent party first. And in all the scenarios I described, the third party, right, the restaurant owner, is the most innocent party. They didn't do anything wrong. Or the kid on the bike who got hit by Stanley's car he didn't do anything wrong. Agency law is always going to look to protect the most innocent party first. And sometimes the way we have to do that is by attaching responsibility to the principal, not just to the agent. Now, you're going to have lots of other questions that we'll discuss in class, like, can the principal sue the agent for acting badly? And the answer is yes. Can the principal ever try to disclaim agency by saying, like, hey, you don't get to be our agent in these areas? And the answer is it depends. You may be thinking to yourself, wait a minute, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints lets missionaries keep their name tags. How does that even work? We'll talk about that in class. And so we're going to discuss these sorts of ideas. So come with good questions. All right, so principal agent theory applies to, obviously, employees of a nonprofit. I'm going to do a fun little pop quiz. But actually we're going to do that one in class because it's fun to reveal the answers to that in class. But let me just show you some of what we're going to talk about. Which group employs the most people out of these three? Which of the following industries employs more people than the nonprofit industry? We'll discuss this one in class. What percentage of nonprofit program officers are women versus men? We're going to discuss that in class. And this is my favorite, considering skill, experience, and work duties, what percentage of nonprofit employees are underpaid? We'll discuss that in class as well. And so we're going to just talk about sort of employment in the nonprofit sector, how it looks and works, mostly kind of demographic discussion, and maybe answer some other legal questions you might have. One thing you're going to find is there are a lot of misconceptions about nonprofit employment, and we're going to discuss that question as well. All right, let's spend some time talking about volunteers. Let me show you some observations. This data is a little bit old. It's from 2018, but it's still still pretty indicative of how this works. In 2018, according to volunteeringinamerica.gov, about 30% of Americans volunteered their time. That was roughly 77.5 million people that did so. That's 6.9 billion hours volunteered. And using a value estimate from independent sector, that accounts to about $167 billion in economic value through volunteering. Now, volunteering is interesting because you can't deduct volunteer time from your taxes. And so there's not a tax incentive for people to volunteer, but they do it anyway. And they do it in great numbers and to great benefit to nonprofit organizations. From around this same time period, I don't remember when I collected this, but this is from the last few years. These are the top 10 states as a representation of volunteer rates. So a little over half of people in Utah volunteer. Much of that is serving in church callings. And then you can see the other top 10 states when it comes to volunteering. Where do people volunteer? This graph represents the places that they tend to volunteer. You can see that religious organizations and sports, hobby, cultural arts organizations are where most volunteering happens. I would imagine sports is, mostly youth sports, like coaching for your kids' soccer team kind of a thing. But you can see that these sorts of social services, all the ones in blue, are the most common ways that people volunteer in the United States. To manage volunteers effectively, there are just some things I want to highlight. Make sure you give volunteers very clear expectations. It's easy for volunteers to not know what they're supposed to be doing because nobody told them, and that creates a pretty poor volunteering experience. By the way, the three items I'm going to mention here are things that you may have experienced personally, and if so, come to class with a story to share. So make sure you give your volunteers clear expectations about what they're expected to do and how to do it. Make sure you show very warm appreciation to volunteers. Sometimes volunteers are inadvertently or deliberately neglected by nonprofits. The staff can get very busy and the volunteers feel disrespected because they haven't been shown proper appreciation for their contributions. And also find mechanisms for volunteers to give you information, to pass feedback along up the chain to staff and leaders. The reason this matters is because volunteers often see and hear things that you'd never have access to. And so you need a process for volunteers to be able to do that. So these are sort of three keys I recommend for managing volunteers effectively. Just some final observations I want to bring. First of all, volunteers are not free. They can be very expensive to manage and train. And so don't plan on volunteers being free because they have a high opportunity cost. The time you spend managing volunteers, the resources you spend dealing with volunteers could be directed elsewhere. This is why I generally recommend a volunteer coordinator when you're using lots of volunteers. This should be a standard practice for dealing with volunteers is to have a person who specializes in doing that. And then finally, if you're going to send volunteers out to solicit donations, you should make sure they have made their own donation first. And the reason is because that is a really simple question to ask anybody who's knocking doors or making phone calls. A person on the other end might say, hey, have you donated to this organization? And it's really embarrassing if they haven't. Finally, this last point, as a volunteer and agent, we tend to think of agents as employees, like people who are paid to work for an organization. But principal-agent relationships arise when there's a contract. Contracts don't have to be written. There just has to be a verbal agreement to create this kind of relationship. An agent also doesn't have to be paid. As long as there's an agreement of a principal-agent relationship, that creates one. And what that means is the vast majority of volunteers are agents because the nonprofit and the volunteer have agreed to a relationship where the volunteer is going to do something on behalf of the nonprofit. And to the extent that's the case, a principal-agent relationship has been formed. And so nonprofits that rely on volunteers can expose themselves to a great deal of legal liability without realizing it, because they don't think about volunteers as being their legal representatives, but in a very important way they are, a legally binding way they are. So you need to think about your volunteers as agents for your nonprofit. And we'll discuss that more in class, and I'll see you all then.